Howdy, I'm Jammer. So, in his book, Arguably Essays by Christopher Hitchens, there was one article which I have gone back to over and over and over again, largely because it managed in the first few paragraphs to do something really important, which was lay out a really solid framework for the biography, which most people don't really think about it, but in a lot of ways, the biography is effectively a genre of writing. It's sort of a structure into itself, but because it is about the life of a human being, it's sometimes easy to forget that it's a genre and that we expect certain things from biographies. And Christopher Hitchens, in the essay Mark Twain, American Radical, which was a review of the book The Singular Mark Twain by Fred Kaplan, a book which I started and did not finish because it was awful. Christopher Hitchens more or less says the same thing, and he manages in the first few paragraphs to lay out a couple of rules that I think are really important for anybody who's approaching biographies. He says, there are 4 rules governing literary art in the domain of biography, some say 5. In the singular Mark Twain, Fred Kaplan violates all 5 of them. These 5 require, and note, he lays out the rule and then follows it with an example of why Kaplan fails. I'm not going to read those excuses. I'm just going to read you the rules themselves because they're going to just be important for the book under discussion today. Number 1, that a biography shall cause us to wish we had known its subject in person and inspire in us a desire to improve on such vicarious acquaintance as we possess. Number 2, that the elements of biography make a distinction between the essential and the inessential, winnowing the quotidian and burnishing those moments of glory and elevation that place a human life in the first rank. Number 3, that a biographer furnish something by way of context so that the place of the subject within history and society is illuminated and his progress through life made intelligible by reference to his times. Rule number 4, that the private person be allowed to appear in all his idiosyncrasy and not as a mere reflection of the correspondence or reminiscences of others or as a subjective projection in the mind of the biographer. 5, that a biographer have some conception of his subject which he wishes to advance or defend against prevailing or even erroneous interpretations. Okay. That was a lot of really big words back to back to back to back to back. But I mean, that's Christopher Hitchens, so that's on brand. Now, what does that have to do with today's video? Well, as the title of the video suggested, today's video is going to be about Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Dreams by Michael Allred, Steve Horton, and Laura Allred, with a foreword by the god himself, Mr. Neil Gaiman. Now, why did I want to talk about this book? I had seen it on Amazon, and hopefully, as this t-shirt is a testament, I really like David Bowie. I really originally listened to the album Hunky Dory because my library that I work at has a CD collection, and I was like, David Bowie, I've always heard about him, but the only song I ever heard of his was the song Fame. Not a bad one, but just not his best. Sorry, I just realized my camera's a tad off skew. But whatever the case, he did leave an impression as somebody kind of interesting. And as I had a coworker who was obsessed with David Bowie, and as I had another coworker who was obsessed with David Bowie, I began to read more and more about his life and realized this is somebody that I kind of want to know a little bit more about. And so I checked out books about David Bowie, and I read about his life, and I listened to more and more of his music, and then I realized that he was in a couple of David Lynch movies, or really, Fire Walk With Me by David Lynch. He was a really interesting dude in his life. And then, again, as a queer man, and as somebody who, at least early on in his life, identified as bisexual, that was really interesting as well, that somebody could be bisexual and have such a profound artistic and cultural influence. And the whole reason goes on and on. David Bowie is just the dude. But looking then at this biography, it was a chance, one, to sort of revel in my love of Bowie, but then also, two, look at a graphic biography, which is something that, again, is still a relatively new concept. As I've addressed before, we're still in a really interesting period with a graphic novel. The medium is changing so much as more and more people are approaching the medium of comics as an avenue for expression and not simply as a means of creating simple gag comics or making superhero comics. Again, both legitimate forms of comics, but the primary means of which the medium has expressed. And so, looking at a graphic biography like Bowie, I was like, this might be a chance to talk about biography in the realm of comics. Now, of course, it's me, so I've got to point you towards a couple of other examples before I get into the main video. I promise this won't take too long. But at the same time that Bowie felt kind of revolutionary to me, looking at the medium of comics, it's important to recognize this is not the first instance of a graphic biography. In fact, this book, Mouse, Pulitzer Prize winning graphic novel, you might have heard about it, is in fact effectively a biography of Art Spiegelman's father. And it's basically him just listening to his father narrate his experiences in the Holocaust. While not a sort of traditional biography, we have to understand that this is, in effect, a kind of oral history or a kind of oral biography. And so this book is one of our first examples of it. I've shown this book as well before. This book is actually part of a series of graphic novel biographies about famous artists. There's one about Picasso, there's one about Jean-Michel Basquiat, there's one about Vincent van Gogh. And you see here an instance in which artists are attempting to convey about the life of artists using the medium of comics rather than through the medium of, say, prose. And then, of course, probably a couple of other really good examples is this book here, King by Ho Che Anderson. Ho Che Anderson, which was, in effect, a biography of the life of Martin Luther King. And then a recent book put out by Fantagraphics, which is also really interesting, and I'm really excited to get into it, which is I Know What I Am, The Life and Times of Artemisia Gentileschi. You've probably seen it. I've had it up here on the easel before. And speaking of easel, Josaku. This man, though today predominantly known for his journalistic comics, began his career really out in terms of telling individual stories. That may not necessarily qualify as a biography per se, but it is very much about the personal. And how can you beat this? A recent publication from 10 Speed Press. This is Jack Kirby, The Epic Life of the King of Comics by Tom Skioli. It's literally a biography of the cartoonist Jack Kirby as told through comics. So hopefully you can see there's a lot of really interesting comics biographies out here. Bowie is an interesting example of one, but it's not the first one. Nevertheless, I wanted to talk about it and hopefully try to move forward with the understanding that as we sort of continue with these videos, some of these are going to be about fantastic stories, some of these are going to be slice of life stories, some of these are going to be gag comics, newspaper strips, what have you. But we also have to recognize that a book like Bowie is a reminder that comics can be whatever you want them to be. And so with that in hand, let's now get into what exactly is Bowie about. I mean, we kind of already know what it is, but we have to follow the format here. So what is Bowie about, and why do I think you should care? All right. Now, just a little bit of background here. David Bowie was originally born David Robert Jones, and he was an English singer-songwriter, and of course, there we go. His original name was David Robert Jones, and he was born in Brixton, London, and I'm not going to try to do anything more than that. I'm reading straight off of Wikipedia, okay? The fact of the matter is that though I have read a lot about David Bowie and listened to a lot of his music, I am not about to sit here and give you the life story of David Bowie. I don't know all the details. There are dozens of books at your local public library that are about David Bowie or about the music scene that David Bowie entered into, or maybe there's movies at your library where David Bowie starred in them, or maybe there's CDs or what have you. If you want to know about David Bowie, check out Wikipedia, check out your local public library, and then, go to your local comic book shop and pick up a copy of this. But we'll save those plugs for the end. The point is that David Bowie was a really influential singer that sort of rose to fame in the late 60s, early 1970s, and then managed to, over the course of his career, all the way up until the day he died, who managed to remain relevant, important, and most importantly here, he managed to sort of continually reinvent himself for the times in which he was living. And that's really not like a cliche. Like, there's tons of stories and writings about musicians. They reinvented themselves. David Bowie would transfer from glam to eventually working with guys like Trent Reznor. You can't get a far more dynamic difference than, say, glam rock and Nine Inch Nails. Just saying. Whatever the case, this book, Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Dreams, is, like I said before, it is a biography. It is the life of David Bowie. But it's really important to recognize that, like I began this video with the 5 statements about what a biography is, it's important to recognize that this book does not necessarily meet those 5 terms. And I put those rules out there for a reason. It's not just to show off that I've got a big, heavy book by Christopher Hitchens, although I do have a big, heavy book by Christopher Hitchens. I have a lot of books by Christopher Hitchens, but that's not important. What is important is the fact that when the reader approaches this book, they have to recognize that this is not going to be a straight biography of the life of Bowie, and one need only take a look at a couple of pages from the actual book to read that. In one particular scene, they talk about on the 17th of, or no, excuse me, it's either the 17th or the 29th of July. Of course, it does not give the year in question, of course. Again, if you want the details, go to Wikipedia. We're not interested about numbers, we're interested about comics. On one particular page of the book, we are shown a moment where David Bowie has this kind of vision as he's flying back to Great Britain, where he was living at the time. And you'll note on the wing of the airplane, there is a kind of demon ripping into the plane. Now, TV and sci-fi nerds will automatically recognize this scene for what it is. It's a classic scene. I believe it's 20,000 feet, Nightmare 20,000 feet. It's a classic Twilight Zone episode, which, fun fact, William Shatner starred in. But the scene is important because it's about a man seeing this demon, nobody believes him, and he eventually loses his mind trying to stop the demon from destroying the plane. Now, what does that have to do with David Bowie? Well, not really anything. What's important here is that Michael Allred, the author, is using this kind of pop culture reference to sort of explain the phenomena that David Bowie had as he perceived his own doom. As the scene elaborates, he was flying a plane home when he realized, if I ever fly again, I'm going to die. And from that day, he never flew on an airplane because of that reason. And so what's important here about this is we see right off the bat that this is a biography that's not particularly interested in telling a traditional format. It's not about telling these are the events of David Bowie's life, these are his thoughts, his moods, his feelings. Again, what Allred really does in this is tell a kind of magical biography. And for that, I'm going to have to fall upon another book, Lon Chaney Speaks by Pat Dorian. This is a recent addition to my library. I literally picked it up yesterday, and I thought this could be really fun, both for the channel and then also to read, period. If you don't know who Lon Chaney was, he was a famous actor who did Quasimodo, he did The Phantom of the Opera. He was an amazing talent. And this book is a biography of the man, but it's not what we would probably recognize as a full biography. It notes that no one will ever love you. Let's see. Anguish, he was scorned by the mob. Oh, yes, of course. Here it is. Sorry. I really need to get these things ready before I start it up. But it could have also been an act of self-preservation. This book is not a historical document. An imagined biography is more accurate. The story is inspired by real events and drawn from research, but even today, the majority of Chaney's life remains a mystery. A key word is really important there, an imagined biography. And so, looking at Lon Chaney Speaks, while the events of his life are narrated to the reader, we don't get a full, nuanced perspective with footnotes and endnotes and direct references to interviews, so we can assess for ourselves what the author is doing or not doing. This is effectively, here are the broad general strokes of a man's life. Well, Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Dreams really manages to capture and convey that with one single page. This book is predominantly about the life of David Bowie as he moved from basically a child to a street performer. He was actually a mime, fun fact. And then his slow, steady career as an important character, Ziggy Stardust. Now, you've probably heard that if you've ever had an uncle who listened to classic rock, but Ziggy Stardust was a persona. It was a character that David Bowie effectively created and cultivated, and the character was effectively this alien from Mars who came to planet Earth and made it big as a rock star. And what's interesting about the influence of David Bowie is that while he never managed to really escape the image of Ziggy Stardust, his imagination in fueling and creating such a character allowed him to develop new personas and recreate himself as an artist. Nevertheless, when we're talking about this book here, its primary focus is trying to understand how Bowie rose from basically a no-name musician into the figure of Ziggy Stardust, who was so influential and emotionally riveting that there were people who honestly thought that David Bowie had come from Mars. And it's not that, how you say, outside the realm of possibility to understand that, as you can kind of observe from these images, which are taken from actual outfits and gowns that he wore on stage. David Bowie was really pushing glam rock and really exploring a character. This biography, then, is effectively the biography of the career of Ziggy Stardust before ultimately ending with the rest of the life of David Bowie. And when I say ending with the rest of the life of David Bowie, I mean it. You only have a couple of pages at the end where the reader is sort of given a sort of quick series of full-page panels which show and demonstrate the remainder of the life of David Bowie after his brief early career as Ziggy Stardust. So really, when we're focusing on this book, the reader has to understand this is not a full biography of David Bowie and his life. It's simply about his rise to fame and his establishment as a musician. So, what is the content? Well, I just said it. But then also importantly, why, narratively speaking, why do I think this book matters? Well, this book matters to me because, again, it's an opportunity to observe how artists and cartoonists can approach the biography in the medium of comics in terms of narrative. Again, as Pat Dorian so beautifully put it, this is an imagined biography. And when we consider biography as a genre of writing, we have to remember that some people are going to want nuanced, detailed biography, and there are going to be some people who are going to want the broad impressions left by a human being. They're not going to be happy with Christopher Hitchens and his 5 rules. They're going to want something a little more magical. And especially when you're talking about a man like David Bowie, you can't not talk about magic. I mean, he literally practiced chaos magic. So, what is the content of Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Dreams? It's a story about David Bowie's rise to fame and the cultural impact of Ziggy Stardust and how it just left people amazed and just spellbound by this figure who seemed to be this alien from Mars and who really was just a kid from Brixton who had a powerful imagination. And that's why I think this book is really interesting, because it manages to tell a period of a human being's life, but also manages to capture so much of the magic and energy that that artist was able to create over the course of their career. Now, we've talked now about the narrative of this book. Let's talk a little bit about why formally this book is nothing short of amazing. All right. So now I've told you a little bit about what is Bowie about in terms of the actual content itself. Now let's talk about formally why a book like Bowie is so tremendously important. Well, a minute ago I had a graphic novel up on the screen, and it was this one, Silver Surfer New Dawn by Dan Slott and Michael Allred. I bring it up because the artwork may seem a bit familiar. Michael Allred is the person who actually, for the most part, drew and wrote this particular graphic novel. He's done several works before in the past, and Silver Surfer is probably one of the best places to look at it. I feel a little gross bringing up a Marvel book, but without any hesitation, I can say I loved this book. And one of the reasons I loved this book was largely because of Michael Allred. You need only look at a couple of pages from this graphic novel, and you can see he has a tremendous sense of design when it comes to his pages, in terms of his character designs, in terms of the way that characters sort of move about and the way that they're represented on the page. Allred is, much like my man Kirby here, somebody who has a tremendous amount of concern for the design of the page, as well as for just the energy that you can convey for it. And one need only look through just a few pages of this book to really see what Allred was doing. Whether it be drawing David Bowie interacting with Christopher Lee, who wanted to apparently make an album or make some music with David Bowie. That's right, there's a universe somewhere where David Bowie and Christopher Lee made an album together, and damn it, I'm not in it. It's okay. It's okay. These little things we can do. Or perhaps the next page, where we see a little character by the name of Alice Cooper. You might have heard of him. But you can see just on these two-page spreads how much detail and how much energy is going into the book. I'm going to be honest, formally speaking, I think most of the strength of this book is in the form. Narratively speaking, I was often left a little let down, because when I read a biography, I typically want the 5 rules by Mr. Hitchens. Some people don't want that, though, like I said. But the reader who's approaching this book has to recognize is that this is really not so much, it's not a straight biography, it's an imagined biography. So Allred's really trying to convey the energy that was the life of David Bowie. And at times this can feel a little discombobulating as you're bouncing around through events and interaction in Bowie's career. But what is important, and what is, at least in my mind, really vital, is the fact that Allred does manage to make some interesting design choices while contributing to the narrative. If we look at this page right here, probably one of the most, I would argue, least impressive pages, but still a really solid page. We have a series of long rectangular panels that move us forward throughout the life of young David Bowie. You'll note here up in this panel, we observe how a tragic car accident or a tragic accident resulted in a permanently dilated pupil, so that one pupil was always bigger than the other. That's a trick you would probably see Marilyn Manson trying to accomplish. And then we see, as Bowie tried to sort of establish himself as a musician, some of the various bands and people that he worked with, and then, of course, trying to understand his sort of artistic development as a mime. David Bowie was a mime. I mean, I can see it, but it's just weird, you know? I don't, It's just a tad peculiar. But, again, looking at those little layouts of the panels, you can see those may not have been terribly impressive, but there's still a great amount of energy and play into them. And once David Bowie really begins to become established as Ziggy Stardust, we begin to see even more imaginative play on Allred's part. In one particular scene that, forewarning, I'm about to nerd the hell out of here, but you'll note in one particular scene, David Bowie was performing as Ziggy with his band at a show. And then afterwards, some of the members of a small group by the name of Monty Python, again, you might have heard of them at some point, came by to tell him how much he loved the show. Now, again, anybody who has ever watched the original television series by Monty Python will recognize John Cleese's part in The Ministry of Silly Walks, and then anybody who's ever watched any of the Monty Python movies will probably recognize some of the characters on the screen. Now, again, this is an imagined biography, though, because if you look at this here, you'll note one very important thing. Right here, you have King Arthur. King Arthur was played by Graham Chapman, and that's pretty much what Chapman did in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. With some exceptions, he played some other small characters. But you'll also note, King Arthur is here. And over here, we have the character of Brian, who was also played by Graham Chapman. How can a man exist in 2 places at one time? Well, let's also do something else here. Let me find it. Oh, yeah. If you look right here, The person speaking is Sir Lancelot. Sir Lancelot in the original movie Monty Python and the Holy Grail was played by John Cleese. And then if you look right next to him, you see the sorcerer Tim. Tim was also played by John Cleese. Again, it's a little thing that only uber nerds like me are going to pick up on, but it's an important one design-wise, because Allred's clearly trying to show his reader that we're not trying to tell a minutia-based biography. We're trying to sort of capture this energy and free-flowing creativity that was often inspired by Bowie and the effect that he would have on people. These pages, over time, can become just these sort of complex networks of interesting panel layouts and panel designs. And there's some where he seems to sort of completely abandon the notion of panels at all, as we see album covers interacting with scenes from movies, interacting with backgrounds and landscapes in concert. It becomes difficult sometimes for the eye to latch on, but Allred, to his credit, does manage to keep the reader centered, so that even on some of these most complex pages, I can still follow the gist of the story. And using the Monty Python example, I did that because I memorized every line of Monty Python and the Holy Grail because I had no life in high school. I mean, I wish I could say there was another reason, but yeah, that's pretty much it. But whatever the case, what's important about this book, formally speaking, is that it has a lot of energy to it. And then also, it really should be noted that Allred and his team really managed to use color in a really effective fashion. He's able to convey accurately without sort of falling into sort of garish choices, dare I say. I guess what I'm attempting to note here is, if you look at a page like this where there's so much happening at once, though the reader is sort of assaulted with images, what's important here is the important choice of colors manages to convey the attitude and the tones and the actual zeitgeist of what was taking place around David Bowie without necessarily sacrificing the actual scenes themselves. So, yes, we have Bruce Springsteen here in the lower left-hand corner next to David Bowie in this totally bizarre outfit, but neither one feels like they're existing at the expense of the other. No matter how complex Allred gets, he keeps the reader's eye moving in the right direction. There's some pages where I admit I wish he would have sort of slowed down a little bit, but even then, the joy of this book is just looking at the artwork. Because even if I'm not always following or paying as much attention as I should to the details of the narrative, I'm just lost in these gorgeous, sumptuous pages that make me want to drool. Like, seriously, one need only look at a few pages of this book to see that Allred is really trying to just sort of capture the life of Bowie and capture the energy and just the mysticism that sort of surrounds this man and the creativity that he left behind. Formally speaking, Bowie's amazing. Content-wise, I admit, fully, I was not particularly impressed by this book because it really didn't give me a lot of new material, or it really didn't give me a clear story, which was something I did kind of want with this book. But I'm going to recommend it because, formally speaking, this book is amazing, and it's a study of composition and design and color, and anybody who loves comics and anybody who cares about comics really should take the time to read this book, because it's a way of sort of inspiring, and in the way Bowie managed to inspire generations of designers and fashion designers and artists and musicians. Allred manages to convey that and communicate that to his reader in a way that honestly is inspiring, which, you know, is kind of the point of art. Just saying. Okay, let's do the last hurrah and call it a day. What more need be said? Bowie, Stardust, Ray Guns, and Moon Age Dreams by Michael Allred is just beautiful. It is a wonderful book. It is not, again, as I said before, a biography that's going to make fans of the genre of biography particularly happy, because again, Mr. Hitchens, or as Mr. Hitchens so beautifully put it, there's expectations with a genre of biography, and one of the ways we can appreciate a biography is if the person seems real. Content-wise, probably the weakest aspect of this biography is that Bowie, as a man, doesn't always necessarily comes through. He comes across more as a persona. He comes across as Ziggy Stardust. But, again, that in itself kind of works in its favor, because Allred's book is trying to understand what that character was and how that character came to be. And so, in its own way, as I pointed out with the Lon Chaney biography, this is an imagined biography. This is a book that gives readers a chance to sort of feel and explore the energy of Bowie and what he managed to do in his early career. And so in that way, it is an effective biography in the way that it offers readers a chance to reconsider what a biography actually is, especially in terms of a graphic novel format. And then, stylistically and formally, Bowie is quite possibly one of the most beautiful books you'll ever read. Visually, every single page is a work of art and a careful examination of design, composition, color, and again, that lovely E word that I just keep dropping and can't stop saying, energy. Bowie, more than anything else, is going to leave you spellbound, or at the very least, impressed and kind of awed at the fact that, yes, we can do something like this in comics, which hopefully will then inspire the next generation to go, if they can do it, I can do it. And in its own way, that's one of the appeals of the biography, is cutting through that awe and recognizing that what is being accomplished is attainable. All right, I'm going to end it there. Thank you so much for watching, and I tremendously appreciate it. If you are interested in reading Bowie, I would definitely recommend it. As always, check out your local public library first, because they probably have a copy of it. If they don't, they can probably get it to you through interlibrary loan. And likewise, we are talking about a comic book. You do live in a nation with comic book shops, and, you know, they're hurting right now, and they need your help. So, go to your comic book shop first. Don't go to Amazon. Go to your comic book shop. Ask them for a copy of the book. If they don't have it, see if they can order it for you. Thank you, as always, for watching. I tremendously appreciate it. Like, share, and subscribe, all that jazz. It helps me know that you're liking these and that you want to see more. If you have suggestions for books that you think are pretty cool and you want to share, by all means. I may not always respond right away because I'm kind of socially awkward, but I promise I am looking at them. So please, tell me what you're reading. Tell me what you like about them. And then just, by all means, let me know what you think about Bowie. Thank you so much for your time. I tremendously appreciate it. Go read some comics.